A couple of thanks first. Thanks to CEDA first for actually holding this event in Cairns. We see, as a region, we see CEDA as a very important institution. It gets that debate going about key economic policies and has that real ability to bring people together, which is why we've got such a good group of people here today. I think it's fantastic. And Paul, thank you very much as the first presentation of the interim report, bringing it to Cairns. We're very pleased to see that happen and very pleased to have the chance to drill a little bit deeper. Just quickly a little bit about myself. So yes, Professor of Tropical Regional Development at James Cook University. And I'm in that business, I reckon, because I'm a strong believer of the relationship between the city and the bush being one of the foundations of our society. If we get that relationship wrong, we've got a sustainability problem as a region, as a society as a whole. So this piece of work, fantastically timely because of a lot of work and review that's happening at the government at the moment, but it's actually one of those foundation stones for our economy as well. So it's very great to see that happen. In my spare time, Chair of Regional Development Australia, Far North Queensland, Torres Strait. So I work with all of our great friends here from Advanced Cairns to Chamber, councils and others in that business of regional development. And it's nice to have that perspective both from a research and a practical point of view. So we're going to ask some questions. I'm going to tease out, just to get things going, tease out some of the big findings that we sort of heard. And certainly we heard a lot about the first time coming to that adaptive capacity sort of metric. And I think that is a really important conversation to be having, and one that can be, I think, continuously improved through the conversation you're just about to go through. Because at least it gives us a reason to start talking about what are the differential policies that are needed across Australia and different regions, because every region is indeed, as you're saying, significantly different. That issue is obviously throwing up some important issues, as you're saying, in relation to some of the fast growth issues and the FIFO and other issues associated with the mining. But it's also teasing out the strengths in agricultural regions, but also some of the deficiencies that are emerging out of growth. And I think you're also saying very strongly out of that manufacturing-based regions in particular have got some significant problems emerging as a result. The other things I heard out of it were really around the need to be starting to think about a framework for regional development and what does that look like? What are the policy settings that we sort of need to have at that national state level? And then very nicely you're dropping into a couple of no regrets policy agendas and ones I'd be strongly supportive of around issues of regulation. But most importantly, your recommendations around how we might grow, if you like, the endemic capacity of regions, the capacity of regions in place to build their long-term futures based on their competitive advantage. I think that's what I heard. So I'm going to tease it open for questions, but I'm going to probably start with one for myself. I'm really excited about the adaptive capacity conversation. One of the things I thought was interesting though was mining regions tending to be coming up as the high adaptive capacity regions. A long experience in mining regions, and they're tending to be one of the regions in my experience that actually have a little bit less adaptive capacity, partly because they're resource rich and employment rich, but also extremely subject to rise and fall in commodity markets. And the house price, that house price graph was a classic example of that. So have you got some thoughts about, is the index able to cope with some of those sort of inconsistencies, and what might be one of the issues that you might deal with in tidying that up?
I think this is working. Thanks, Alan. No, I think that it's not general. The regions around Mount Isa are not as resilient as the ones around Pilbara. I think you've got to take that differential. Of course, as I said, the regions are also in the mining areas tend to be lack of diversification, but you can't will that upon them either. So I guess that one factor has been the FIFO workforce, which has allowed a spreading of that downturn to other parts of the economy, the cities and so on. So I think it's early days. I don't want to speculate too much on why some regions are in a particular category than others, and I'd rather, I'm particularly keen, people like yourself, to have a look at the methodology we use to construct that metric and see, is there a flaw in it? should include some other data that we haven't included, for example, and how variable it is. Looking at it over several censuses would, I think, make it a lot stronger too.
I think having it is great because you can start the conversation about how do we strengthen it over time. All right, so I'm going to start, and I'm sitting down, so it's a little bit hard to see or to hardball anybody in the eye about questions. I just saw Trent Toomey's hand move, but I think it was because he was flopping a fly apart. Was that a question, Trent?
Yeah, I was scratching my head, but thanks for that, Al. Paul, you glossed over population growth. I was wondering if, in your previous experience in your migration role, if I could press you a bit more to get some insights. You may not have a silver bullet for us, but, you know, my wife and I have spent a lot of time in Hobart and Newcastle and Canberra where, you know, there's about 300,000 people and the quality of life because of the diversification of the economy just, you know, seems to get to a bit of a sweet point in our personal experience. But I was wondering if you could give us some advice. We think we've got quite a great part of the world. How do we get more people here?
Having 500,000 in Cairns would make a difference, I think, yes, because you get a lot of the social activities that wouldn't otherwise be here. I don't have an answer apart from that. The data seems to suggest that if you have immigrants, which, as I said, the primary driver of population growth in Australia is immigration, if we have immigrants that stay in a region for at least 5 years, they'll tend to stick. That seems to be the research around the world. So people that tend to come to a region from some government program or incentive who are only there for a year or so will move to a city or something. So allowing it to be attractive, it's a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? And I made the point, there's a lot of things that a city needs to have, an attractive lifestyle and obviously resources and water and all the other things that we'd expect to be in a city, transportation, and jobs particularly. Obviously, people won't move to regions if they don't have the jobs. But it is striking that in Australia, most immigrants tend to now settle into Sydney and Melbourne and Perth, and that's not been the case in the past. And I don't know why we haven't grown some of our cities. I mean, Menzies thought that Canberra would have a population of 500,000 or more by the 70s, and we're still about 350,000 in Canberra. So, no, I don't have an answer, and I don't think you can will it to happen. You just play to your strengths, I suppose, is all that I can say. Does someone else have an answer to that question?
I'm very happy to take answers to questions in addition to actual questions. And don't underestimate Trent's will to make things happen. He's he's got a strong will. Go for it, Lisa. Just if you can, when you stand up, just let us know who you are, where you're from, and just wait for the mic to get to you. That's good.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Lisa Law. I'm from James Cook University, and I teach and research in the field of urban design. And I feel like I want to follow on from that a little bit. I work with our council. I'm also working with some of the towns around here about using urban design as a regeneration strategy for how you might improve some of these declines. So one of the things that in my field is that if you look at Richard Florida and a bunch of scholars that are saying that what you need to do is increase your urban fabric needs to be able to attract enough people from other places, and that's where it's going to come from. So instead of the old economic model of industry clusters and you support them, you build the urban fabric and people will come. So in urban design, this is one of the things that people are moving toward. Now, the problem that I have, and maybe you can help me think through, is when you have things like the CRC for Northern Development, they don't want to talk about cities. I've been to those meetings. I've said, how do we get the city on the agenda and into the research? But I think the ideas about what happens here in the north are still so constrained by, it's about resources, about mining, about agriculture. And I think if we can't get the message out there that we have really interesting cities, Cairns now being the Centre for Arts and Culture in Northern Queensland, if we can't get that message out, then we can't attract more people, although some people come from Melbourne anyway. So if you could help us think about I don't know where the urban fits into what you've presented today, although I'm going to use your report for a paper I'm writing. Thank you very much. But how can we get this urban on the agenda for thinking about regions in this part of Australia?
Well, thanks for that. I personally agree that it's cities in the regional areas are critical for the regions, and you can't just say that a region can grow without the city, a regional city, being a part of that. And we're actually doing another product at the Commission at the moment on a 5-year productivity review, and one of the things I'm working on that is about cities actually, so I'm doing regions and cities, and I will incorporate some work on the cities into this project for the final report, because I think that it is important, but I don't have a silver bullet, I'm afraid to say. No.
Thanks, Lisa. Next up, we have one over here.
Ashley Marshall from Australia Post. I look after Queensland and Northern Territory for Australia Post. We have a challenge in the post office. If we move a post office 10 foot to the left, we get crackpot nutter flunkies jumping out of the bushes with a TV camera saying the world's going to end. We have an obligation to keep 4,500 post offices open in Australia. We're the biggest retailer in the country. We've got 1,700 of those in Queensland. A couple of questions and a couple of observations. The data used, Paul, seems to be based on the last census. My observation is it probably wasn't the most successful census we've had in Australia.
No, it was a 2011 census.
Right, okay, because I think the methodology you were talking about, if it was extended over a number of census periods, would have an interesting, maybe different result, don't know, but observation. The second thing is the Northern Australia Fund. I, like many people in this room, I reckon would be incredibly frustrated to see that $5 billion sitting there, locked up, latent, dormant, not doing a thing with it. And if we're going to get people into regions, we need to have government as the seed catalyst to make that happen. I was born in Western Queensland. I love the bush, I love regional Queensland, passionate Queenslander. We've got all that money sitting there and nothing's happened with it. How do we take this highly intellectualised quality research, link it into those people that can unlock that money and drive growth in Northern Australia?
I wish I knew an answer to that.
But there's a statement and a question. So.
As for the census, I think there were a lot of concerns about the collection of it last year. I think a lot of them were overstated in terms of privacy. I was mentioning to Sandra here earlier that one of the problems was that the concerns about what type of data you provide to the ABS, and there were some exaggerations about that being lost when people provide much more to their bank or other, to Facebook even, which is a bit surprising. But that said, I'm quietly confident the data will be quite helpful, but we're not just relying on the 2016 census, which for our purposes will be in October approximately, but we are using other census, and we're not just relying on census data too, there is a lot of other data. As for the fund that you're talking about, I'm very keen to hear, I'm here more to listen to tell than to tell. It's about what type of programs have worked well in the past. What have been are there any core messages that we can get right across Australia about targeted programs? Are there city deals that they're talking about, one for Townsville, for example? Are they likely to be good because they're supposed to be based upon local leadership and a coordination of state and federal government programs? If that's working well, again, I go back to my original point, which was that there are a lot of programs that have been designed for rural and regional Australia, and not many of them have been evaluated for whether they actually achieve what they've been set out to do. And surely that's the most important thing to do first, is to do, where should the money be allocated and what type of program is most likely to work. And I think, as I said, local leadership I think is a crux to that. And I don't think I can add anything more at this stage. But if you've got any suggestions about how to evaluate a program, I'll listen to that.
Good. Thank you. Righto, over the back corner we have Scott. Again, if you can just let us know who you are, where you're from.
Good evening or good afternoon. That glass of wine's got in my head. Scott Davis. I run a group called the Greater Northern Australia Regional Training Network based at GCU. Your comment about this pull-push tension between the state and federal initiatives really resonates with me, particularly in the Northern Australia context. But internationally, there's really good examples of actually how we're actually internationally, there's really good examples how communities are actually starting to transition their economies. So 2 questions. How do you develop that alignment in a politically challenging environment? And the second question is, what are the international lessons we can learn which you can actually bring forward into an Australia regional context?
As for getting a good alignment, we've had good alignment sometimes in the past and other times not so much. I'm not a politician, so I don't really have a good answer to that. We will provide advice that we think will be sensible. Whether the governments take them up is another matter, and we never try to campaign for our recommendations. We try to steer a neutral course there. I haven't incorporated much in this initial report about overseas experiences, but that is a core research part that we'll be looking at for our final report. And if you have any suggestions, are there anything in Canada or the US or Europe or other countries that have similar characteristics to Australia? But of course, I did mention earlier that a lot of those countries have very large, lots of moderate-sized cities, which we tend not to have. And I think that would make a big difference if we had some larger regional towns. Cities.
Do you think we're in a receptive policy environment for some of these recommendations at the moment? Or?
Oh, I think so. I mean, in the end, governments, you've got to give the idea, the governments want to be elected, and if they want to be re-elected, they have to have policies that resonate with communities. This is not atypical. For the first 10 years of federation, there were, eight governments, if I'm not mistaken, so stability and instability tend to follow each other.
It's a cycle. All right. Anyone over this side of the room? We have, I think, almost. Susan's going to dong someone on the head with that thing in a minute. Well, we've got a problem here because dinner's going to, the dessert's going to come out, and that's going to distract everybody. Again, who you are and where you're from.
Terry Reid, I'm with the Department of Natural Resources and Mines. Just looking at the natural resources side of things, you alluded that the availability of land or other resources was an important consideration. Just wondering if you can expand a little bit more on, for an area like Cairns, where there's obviously a lot of natural value and natural assets and land use conflicts, if you like, potential there. If you can expand a little bit more on how you've looked at that sort of natural resource asset base.
Well, firstly, we looked at it in our previous report on agriculture about property rights, because Australia, the minerals and subsurface resources are owned by the state government, which is quite different to the United States, where if you own property, you own everything that's beneath the property too. And we never proposed that we should change that property rights, but it does make a difference to incentives for individuals and corporations to develop regions, and it does put into tension. And if I give an example from a report that we did about 2 years ago on gas markets, which I think is topical now again, that one of the messages that came out there were that some of the early operations by gas developers were quite poor relations with farmers and so on. They tended to knock over fences, leave gates open and so on. I think they cleaned up their act somewhat after that, but having a good relationship between the developer and the agricultural producer is critical for that, and being compensated for the damage to your property, obviously. As for residential versus, say, agricultural producers, you've seen term conflicts between what you might call as a not in my backyard, where a large activity like a pig farm or say egg producing or something like that has occurred, and then people are buying little lifestyle blocks nearby, and over time they lobby to reduce the activity or not allow it to expand. And these are the types of things that's happening not just in Queensland but elsewhere. And I think governments, both state governments and local councils, have to be reasonable in that type of approach, that when they have an approval process it's clear, that people can understand it and that it's timely. And because people need an approval, it should be fairly done and transparently done, but it shouldn't take forever to get an approval. And that matters not just as much for the environment as much as for animal welfare and all the other matters that go with that. Does that answer the question?
It does. How does it build into some of the resilience or the adaptiveness, the availability of natural resources?
Well, an economy depends upon a whole lot of activities, and if you make it difficult for new activities to start up, then of course you're going to make it more difficult for that economy to grow.
Good. Thanks, Jerry. Good to see you again. Haven't seen you for a few years. Right, we've got one over here. Thank you. Again, if you can just wait for the mic.
Commissioner Ren Neiman from McCullough Robinson. How important do you think tax reform would play as a role in developing and transitioning regional economies, looking at housing affordability, looking at regional tax incentives? What do you see as sort of on the agenda going forward? Because obviously Productivity Commission will play an important role seeing how that would work out in practice.
We're not specifically looking at tax, but you're quite right that tax systems generally, both state and federal level, need some level of reform, and ideally the general rule for taxation is it should be a wider base and a lower rate, because as rates tend to grow, they cause more distortions to economic activity. But that's a general rule. So once you start deciding that you want to assist something for one way or another, you have to decide how to assist it. Is it going to be through a grant or a loan or some tax concession? And I guess the general rule that the Commission would have would be that something that's clear is better than something that's unclear, and that it should be evaluated for its effectiveness. And you should always be aware that if you're subsidising one activity, you're effectively taxing another activity. So we do want a level playing field there. I do say that we've just received in terms of reference the other day on state transfers, GST transfers through the Commonwealth Grant Scheme. That hasn't even started yet, but that will be something that'll be quite interesting to watch that space, I guess. But I do get concerned that sometimes these things are a zero-sum game, because if there's an X amount of take, and if it gets divided one way or another way, it's really just redividing an existing cake. How do you make the cake larger? How do you provide the right incentives to people so that they don't get discouraged from doing things, for example?
Don't forget you can hoe into your dessert while we're here. No need to wait. Any other quick questions from the back there? We've got about another 5 minutes or so to go, so I want to make sure we get all our questions out. Kelsey.
Kelsey from the Department of State Development. You mentioned about the linkage or the unalignment, I suppose, between federal and state government funding programs. In regards to transitioning regional economies, did your analysis take into account the role that LGAs play? And if so, about the alignment of potentially their programs or direction or strategies in regards to realigning their local community?
Well, I think as far as LGA programs are concerned, we've mentioned it briefly in the report. It's I think what I'd like to say about policy generally is that we've just tried to create a framework at this stage. We'll be looking at more on the policy space for our final report, and the linkages of different levels of government, including LGAs, I think is important there. As I say, evaluation of programs is also important, but I don't have really much at this stage to say on those. Apart from LGA, any policy should be included in the analysis.
Now, I'm going to make the observation, we've had a lot of blokey questions here. I want to see a little bit more diversity in the questions coming through. Who have we got? Anyone? Any takers on that? We had one. Good. All right. There's one I want to tease out a little bit, and it's around the issue of regulation being identified as one of the big issues you want to work as a bit of a no regrets issue. Certainly, the research and the experience we're finding across Northern Australia is that it's a complex question that really goes to the heart of a higher level of agreement across the landscape between state and federal governments and local governments. The way that's negotiated through framework agreements between conservation, development and Indigenous interests. Then, as you're saying, significant problems in the major development approvals process in its own right, high levels of inefficiency and poor coordination within that, transferring down into tenure and tenure resolution issues. So the report at this stage is saying the focus may be on regulation reduction, so it's a double question. Is there a chance to look at some of these bigger reform issues, which are really driving the difficult, the sort of real barriers, if you like, to investment and investment decision making, and the follow-on conversations about infrastructure and services behind that? But the second part of the question is, if there's going to be a bit of regulatory relaxation, what would that be? So I just want both parts of that question, if you could, Paul.
If I could make an observation that, Alan, that I think, are you all aware about regulation impact statements? They're honoured in the breach. In fact, often they're constructed, they're supposed to inform governments before they take a decision to do X or Y about, is this the best way of doing it and so forth, but often they're just a puff piece to justify a program. I also make a second observation that life is now more risk averse than the past. When an event happens, there's a great tendency for governments to be pressured to do something and to act quickly. And in some cases, I suppose in aviation, for example, that's probably sensible, but not in all cases. And sometimes a lot of these programs or policies happen because of their reaction to some event that's occurred. Now, as to what we'll include in our final, well, that's a great suggestion about broader issues, and I think we should talk more about that. So.
Right.
And by the way, the submission, I do appreciate your submission and look forward to another one too.
Got to thank Rill for that. It was great to be able to have a chance right across the university to be able to look across the many parts and to bring a broader sort of perspective to it in that process. That was good. All right, we have a rundown of time in relation to questions. So you've got your last few minutes to get to the last question on the table, if you do. Or is it that everybody actually is now ensconced in their dessert? We've got one over the back there. Fantastic. And it looks like it's Tamerlan.
Yeah, it is. Hi, Commissioner. My name's Tamerlan Brennan. I'm a member of Jobs Queensland, one of the only 2 regional board members. The other one sitting beside me here. My question, I'm not an economist, so it might be a silly question, but in relation to looking at the adaptability, etc., of regional economies, are you looking at numbers of businesses in a region and the maturity of those businesses? Because if I look at this region, there are a number of businesses that you could identify as being incredibly resilient, having weathered all sorts of storms over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Is that somehow, that sort of nature of businesses taken into account?
Thanks for the question, Tamerlan. I think what I'd say is that on the first occasion, in case of the metric and other, what you'd say, quantitative things that are in the report, you have to rely on data which is collected consistently across Australia. Otherwise, you can't do it. So, but that's not satisfactory. Lots of things in life are not measurable, and that just because something's not measurable doesn't make it more important than something that is measurable. I think there's a lot. I've seen a lot in public policy where people take the metric, and here I'm talking down my own metric, but that take it as more important than something's not measurable. So what we've tried to illustrate in an initial report, and we'll do a lot more in the final report, is to balance that with some anecdotal evidence, with some case studies, if you like, which try to illustrate the depth of things that are not able to be put into a metric. And we can't pretend that they can be put into a metric because I can't consistently measure something across Australia.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to ask you for one last statement about your feeling about the implications of this for this region, for the Far North Queensland region.
I think that we use this as an advice. We want to help get better policies that will contribute to better outcomes for the people of Australia. This is an initial report. I encourage you, if you want to help yourself get to sleep at night, perhaps read the full thing. Otherwise, I want to engage more fully over time. Till the final report's not till December, so there's a fair bit of time. Please think about putting a submission in. Please it doesn't have to be a long thing, it can be quite simple. Anecdotal evidence or case studies, if you've got some suggestions, that would be great. If you've got things that you think you'd like us to visit that would be helpful to our analysis, please let me know. My contact I can leave with CEDA will know, so that's pretty easy. And I think the Commission is very open to suggestions, and I do emphasise that we're not a silver bullet, we're not the font of all knowledge, we're just a form of advice which we hope is based upon good evidence. And if you don't think that the initial report's very good in some area or it's deficient, please let me know.
Thanks, Paul. And I'm going to encourage everybody here to have a deep look and actually respond to this interim report as well. So we have a strong regional response to a very important report. Thank you very much, Paul. Much appreciated. I'd like everyone to bring their hands together and thank Paul for both the speeches.